June 4th, 1943. A pencil trembled in the hands of a German soldier as he wrote words that could have landed him in solitary confinement. "The Americans must be lying to us," he scribbled in his hidden diary. "No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, Untersturmführer Werner Burkhardt had just witnessed something that shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window blazed with electric light. An endless constellation of power stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Rural electrification barely reached 20% of German farms, even before the war. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda called a decadent, collapsed America, electricity flowed like water. When the train pulled into Mexia, Texas, 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped onto the platform. They had traveled from Tunisia not in cattle cars or freight wagons, but in cushioned Pullman coaches with dining service and sleeping berths. The entire town had turned out to see them arrive. What none of these prisoners knew was that they were about to experience the most devastating psychological weapon America possessed. Not bombs, not bullets, but something far more powerful. They were about to see the truth. And that truth would break them more completely than any battlefield defeat ever could. The collapse had begun 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, May 13th, 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered along with 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. These were the Wehrmacht's most experienced desert fighters, men who had driven the British back to Egypt, who had earned the grudging respect of Montgomery himself. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, documented what was about to unfold. The journey from defeat to revelation began in the port of Oran, Algeria. As 30,000 prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships, American efficiency started cracking their assumptions. The U.S. Army processed thousands daily with organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at its peak. Identity cards photographed and filed, medical examinations completed, inoculations administered, Geneva Convention rights explained in fluent German by officers trained specifically for this moment. Then came the first shock. The food. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, would later write to his mother about it. While waiting for ships in Oran, the Americans fed them better than they'd eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. They thought it was propaganda, a show put on to impress them. They didn't realize this was standard American military ration. The Liberty ships carrying them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial power. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A fact that would have been dismissed as impossible propaganda if they'd known it. These vessels were being produced at a rate of 3 per day at peak production. They were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater, and rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo. Up to 30,000 prisoners per month by summer 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing provided the second phase of demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account. The ship's crew, he noted, disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock the prisoners, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. Prisoners discovered that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,700 Liberty ships that would be built during the war. Each one required 250,000 parts assembled from components manufactured in 32 states. The engines were built in 3 separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs about watching the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which they believed only Germany, and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then he first suspected that Germany had already lost the war. August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America shattered what remained of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres. Its docks stretched for miles. Its cranes loaded and unloaded dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. The prisoners formed columns for the march to waiting trains. Along the route, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained a privilege of the wealthy and party elite. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars, but nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. Not boxcars, not the 40-and-8 wagons that had carried German troops across Europe, full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Feldwebel Radke wrote that they boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The American Guard seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning, in August. They had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that couldn't exist according to everything they'd been told. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro. Communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights burning in multiple rooms. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing, parking lots full, even at midnight. Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father was a Nazi party block leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered decades later. They passed through dozens of cities that first night. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told them this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. He called them liars. They just shrugged and said he would see. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. Prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority. More disturbing was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties into bins without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. As trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, prisoners encountered American industrial power in full display. Through windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, trains slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from E.G. Farben, understood the implications immediately. In a post-war interview, he recalled being able to see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything they had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told the prisoners there were dozens more across the country. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. They had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat. But he could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than anyone could imagine possible. The deeper trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. Prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary about watching them load a single barge with enough wheat to feed his entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than their weekly ration. In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German prisoners who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread." The guard bought hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food. The arrival at Camp Hearn, Texas, provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Built in just 4 months, it housed between 3,000 and 4,000 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberstarzt Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. All standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify. This miracle drug that they had only heard rumors about. Americans used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving them their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote about throwing away more food than his family had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. American regulations required they prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner received full rations. The surplus was discarded. He wept as he threw perfectly good bread into the garbage. By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of prisoners in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat, the factories running 3 shifts, the shops full of goods, the parking lots full of cars, the houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the black workers, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm they passed was the same. In Nebraska, Prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, witnessing agricultural mechanization that defied comprehension. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one larger than entire German counties. The farmers spoke casually of yields that would have been fantasy in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scottsbluff, wrote about the farmer's son, a boy of 16, driving a tractor worth more than everything his father had earned in his lifetime. When he mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better. The most devastating revelations came to prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, prisoners could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality allowed thousands of German prisoners to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking coffee. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. They could see the parking lots, wrote Obergefreiter Franz Kellner. Thousands of cars belonging to workers. Workers. In Germany, even their officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told them many workers owned 2 cars. One for work, one for family use. They thought he was mocking them. But beneath this surface of American prosperity and apparent kindness, something dark was unfolding inside the camps themselves. Something the American authorities hadn't anticipated and struggled to control. Not all the prisoners were grateful for their treatment. Not all of them wanted to see the truth. And some were willing to kill to prevent others from accepting it. At Camp Hearn, the same camp that housed prisoners in comfortable barracks with hot showers and abundant food, a different kind of war was being waged. Nazi loyalists, hardcore SS officers, and fanatical party members had maintained their command structure even in captivity. They ran secret tribunals, published underground newspapers, and enforced discipline through intimidation and violence. Prisoners who expressed doubts about the Nazi cause, who became too friendly with American guards, or who dared to criticize Hitler, found themselves facing German military justice behind American barbed wire. The first murder happened quietly. A prisoner found hanging in his barracks, initially ruled self-inflicted, then another, and another. 7 prisoners across multiple camps, beaten, hanged, strangled. Their crime? Being too willing to accept democracy, too quick to admit that maybe, just maybe, everything they'd been told was a lie. Hugo Kraus made that mistake at Camp Hearn. In March 1944, He criticized Hitler in front of the wrong people. 5 Nazi loyalists took him to a secluded barracks and beat him to death with boards embedded with nails. They staged it to look like an accident during a work detail. But American investigators weren't fooled. The camp had become a killing ground, and the perpetrators weren't Americans. They were Germans, murdering other Germans for the crime of changing their minds. The American response was swift and created an international crisis that would echo all the way to the highest levels of government. 15 German prisoners were arrested, investigated, and brought before secret military tribunals. The proceedings were conducted entirely out of public view. Leon Jaworski, a young military prosecutor who would later become famous as the Watergate Special Prosecutor, led the cases. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, physical evidence, confessions. All 15 were convicted. All 15 were sentenced to hang. But Germany wasn't about to let that happen without retaliation. Through Swiss intermediaries, the Nazi government delivered a chilling message. If America executed those 15 German prisoners, Germany would execute 15 American prisoners of war in return. The condemned Americans had committed minor infractions. One had blocked a sergeant putting up a poster. Another had talked back to a guard. Trivial offenses that would normally result in solitary confinement or loss of privileges. Now, they faced death because of murders committed on American soil by German prisoners. The diplomatic standoff reached the highest levels. Military commanders, State Department officials, even President Truman became involved. The stakes couldn't have been higher. America had prosecuted German prisoners under military law for crimes committed in American camps. To back down would undermine the entire justice system and encourage more violence. But to proceed would condemn 15 innocent Americans to death for Germany's revenge. The irony was inescapable. German prisoners were safer on battlefields than they were in American prison camps, surrounded by their own countrymen. The very men who had witnessed American prosperity and humanity were more afraid of fellow Germans than of their American captors. The Nazi ideology they were supposedly fighting for had followed them across the ocean and was now killing them for daring to question it. In the end, 14 of the 15 German prisoners were hanged. President Truman personally commuted one sentence, but the others were executed for murder. Germany, true to its threat, executed the 15 American prisoners. The exchange was brutal, senseless, and revealed the fundamental difference between the two systems. America executed prisoners for actual murder after full trials with evidence and defense attorneys. Germany executed prisoners for revenge, for propaganda, to maintain fear. The murders and executions sent shockwaves through the camp system, but they didn't stop the transformation that was already underway. If anything, they accelerated it. Prisoners who had been on the fence, unsure whether to trust what they were seeing, now had proof of what Nazi loyalty actually meant. It meant kangaroo courts in barracks. It meant murder for thought crimes. It meant a system so terrified of truth that it would kill to suppress it. By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of everything prisoners had witnessed was producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's Office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Neuland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943 that prisoners no longer argued when shown production statistics. They had seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis had become quiet. They still maintained loyalty to Germany, but no longer spoke of victory. Many openly questioned what they had been told about America. The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors about being told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day he was there, he saw the opposite. This was the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. They had been told fairy tales by criminals. Christmas, 1943, provided the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, enemy soldiers who had been trying to kill Americans months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, the same camp where Hugo Kraus had been murdered, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote about Americans knowing they were enemies. Many had sons and husbands fighting against German armies, yet they showed Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. Prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. Feldwebel Hans Meyer wrote about eating like kings, better than German generals ate, better than party leaders. And this was not special. The guards told them this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they could feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was insatiable. Prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints. Something impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann, Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote about American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, teaching them without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies. This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Josef Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker." In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production reached its peak. German prisoners worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could counter. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched as workers assembled 700 boats per month, each one requiring 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeld-Webel, Kurt Zimmermann, wrote about women doing men's work, black workers operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything they were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than the entire German Navy built in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German comprehension. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann, who had worked at Krupp before the war, wrote about thinking he understood industrial production. But this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than Germany could produce. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities they couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts. The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, witnessing agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they watched wheat harvests, where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote about one American farmer with machinery doing the work of 100 German farmers. They showed him aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes. Fruit that would have been treasured in Germany. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. They begged to be allowed to send them to Germany, to their families. The guards were sympathetic but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation defied comprehension. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. This demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system that delivered 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they'd been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Steuben wrote about knowing then that everything was lost. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. They had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. They sent horses against trucks, rifles against automatic weapons, courage against unlimited resources. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, prisoners discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany. To enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Feldwebel Otto Krebs. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared prisoners to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to the elite in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote about treating attempted self-harm cases with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength they never understood: the confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. They became missionaries for democracy, admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview. Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. They saw it work. They saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. They wanted that for Germany. The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s. April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had maintained some pride in German honor, despite military defeat, now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they had fought for was not just defeated, but evil. Feldwebel Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. They thought they were warriors for a great cause. They discovered they were tools of criminals. They believed they were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. They found that they were the barbarians. The Americans they called weak and decadent showed them what civilization actually meant. As the war ended in May 1945, German prisoners faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They had witnessed an America that contradicted everything they'd believed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. They prepared prisoners to rebuild their country, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Steuben. They gave them skills, knowledge, hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious: knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German prisoners who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They had seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they'd witnessed a society that had achieved it. Many former prisoners rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. They learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. They saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German prisoners held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. They discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, they discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa, added that the farmers treated them not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity, from people whose sons were fighting against them changed prisoners forever. At the reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Götz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. They came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. They left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed them that strength comes not from conquest but from production, not from hatred but from diversity, not from tyranny but from freedom. They witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. They saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. They learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. They returned to Germany with a mission: to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. They who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. The magnitude of the German prisoner experience in America can be measured in stark statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, 175 main camps with 325 branch camps. Camps built to house from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction completed in an average of 90 days per camp. 371,683 German prisoners, part of 425,871 total Axis prisoners. Peak population in May 1945. Average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly in 1943. 30,000 monthly after D-Day. 60,000 monthly in the final months of war. The labor contribution was staggering. 14 million man-days of agricultural labor. 100 million board feet of lumber processed. $230 million in labor value in 1940s currency. 80 cents daily wage per prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. But the escape statistics reveal something far more important than labor numbers. Only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners. 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most escapees recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians harmed by escaped prisoners. Think about that for a moment. 371,000 enemy soldiers, many of them hardened combat veterans, held in camps across America, and almost none of them tried to escape. Why would they? Where would they go? Back to a Germany being destroyed by bombs. Back to a system that had lied to them about everything. Back to face the very ideology that had murdered their fellow prisoners for daring to question it. The educational programs tell the real story of transformation. 40,000 plus enrolled in educational courses. 135 camp newspapers published. 30,000 taking English classes. 15,000 in vocational training. University correspondence courses for 8,000. These weren't prisoners waiting to go home and resume the fight. These were students preparing for a different future. Treatment assessment surveys conducted after the war revealed the depth of the transformation. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The post-war immigration numbers tell their own story. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States after the war. 12,000 plus maintained correspondence with American families. Average correspondence duration was 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. The enemies had become friends, and the friends had become family. The German prisoners who experienced American industrial might didn't just witness history, they were transformed by it. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. And their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. But the transformation came at a cost that's often forgotten in the triumphant narrative of re-education and conversion. Hugo Kraus and the 6 other prisoners murdered by their fellow Germans paid the ultimate price for daring to see the truth. The 15 Americans executed in retaliation paid for German crimes committed on American soil. The 14 Germans hanged for those murders discovered that American justice, unlike Nazi propaganda, was real and impartial. The murders inside the camps revealed something profound about the nature of totalitarian ideology. It wasn't enough for Nazi loyalists to lose the war. It wasn't enough for them to witness overwhelming evidence that everything they'd been told was false. They would rather kill fellow Germans than admit they'd been wrong. They would rather maintain the lie through terror than accept the truth through reason. And in that desperate violence, they proved exactly what America had been fighting against. Not just a military enemy, but an ideology so fragile, so divorced from reality, that it could only survive through force and fear. An ideology that collapsed the moment its adherents were exposed to actual freedom, actual prosperity, actual dignity. The irony was that the murders and executions probably accelerated the transformation they were meant to prevent. Prisoners who had been wavering, unsure whether to trust what they were seeing, now had undeniable proof. The Nazi system they'd served would kill them for thought crimes. The American system they'd fought against would give them second chances, education, dignity, and eventually friendship. In the end, America won the propaganda war not through clever messages or sophisticated psychological operations, but through sheer reality. Every full meal was an argument against Nazism. Every electric light was evidence of democratic prosperity. Every working toilet was proof of industrial superiority. Every kind gesture from American civilians was a demolition of racial ideology. The prisoners were converted by prosperity, yes, but also by humanity. They saw that a nation could be powerful without being cruel, that a people could be confident without being arrogant, that a system could be organized without being oppressive, that diversity could be strength rather than weakness. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, concluded that America won by letting prisoners see the truth. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. But it was more than prosperity. It was the combination of overwhelming material superiority and surprising moral character. It was the paradox of a nation so powerful it could afford to be generous, so confident it could afford to be kind, so secure it could afford to show mercy to enemies. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich, young men who believed they were fighting for racial superiority, for German greatness, for a 1,000-year empire. Men who had been told that Americans were weak, decadent, divided, incapable of matching German military prowess. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy, men who had seen that prosperity came from freedom, that diversity created strength, that democracy produced results. Men who knew from first-hand experience that everything they'd been taught was a lie, and that the truth was better than any propaganda. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and occupied. Cities reduced to rubble, industries dismantled, political systems shattered, families torn apart. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, hadn't made it to 13, and they returned knowing exactly why. They had seen what a free society could produce. They had witnessed what democracy could achieve. They had experienced what industrial capitalism could create. And they brought that knowledge home with them, determined to rebuild Germany, not as a renewed dictatorship, but as a democratic partner in a free world. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on many foundations. The Marshall Plan, certainly. American economic aid, absolutely. The hard work of the German people, without question. But also on knowledge gained in American prison camps by 371,000 former enemies who had seen the future and knew it worked. Hans Kroll didn't become West German ambassador to the United States by accident. Walter Hallstein didn't become president of the European Commission through luck. Rüdiger von Weckmar didn't serve at the United Nations by chance. Eduard Ackermann didn't transform German agriculture through coincidence. They rose to leadership because they understood something that many Germans didn't. They had seen America at its peak, and they knew what was possible. They brought American methods to German boardrooms. They brought American efficiency to German factories. They brought American agricultural techniques to German farms. And most importantly, they brought American democratic ideals to German political institutions. The new Germany was built by men who had learned their most important lessons as prisoners of war. The Atlantic Alliance that defined the post-war world was built on this foundation of transformed enemies. NATO, the European Economic Community, the entire architecture of Western cooperation was possible because former enemies had become partners. And that transformation began in prison camps scattered across America, where enemy soldiers learned that the nation they'd fought against was the one they should have emulated. The story of German prisoners in America is ultimately a story about the power of truth. Not propaganda, not coercion, not indoctrination, but simple, overwhelming truth. The truth of electric lights in every farmhouse. The truth of abundance in every store. The truth of dignity in every interaction. The truth of a system that actually worked the way it claimed to work. Nazi ideology collapsed not because Americans told prisoners it was wrong, but because prisoners could see with their own eyes that it was false. The master race theory dissolved when they watched black workers operating complex machinery. The cultural superiority myth evaporated when they discovered American universities leading the world in research. The military supremacy delusion shattered when they witnessed factories producing bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. And perhaps most devastatingly, the propaganda about American weakness and decadence fell apart when prisoners experienced genuine kindness from people who had every reason to hate them. Church groups sending Christmas packages to enemy soldiers. Farmers sharing meals with prisoners who had been trying to kill Americans months earlier. Families welcoming former enemies into their homes. Doctors treating enemy wounded with the same care as American soldiers. This wasn't weakness. This was the confidence of absolute power. This was the security of a nation so strong it could afford to be generous. This was the character of a people so certain of their values they could show mercy to those who had rejected everything they stood for. The prisoners understood this eventually. The waste they'd initially seen as carelessness, they came to recognize as abundance. The diversity they'd been taught was weakness, they discovered was strength. The openness they'd believed was vulnerability, they learned was confidence. The kindness they'd assumed was sentimentality, they realized was moral superiority. America's greatest victory in World War II wasn't Normandy, or the Battle of the Bulge, or the crossing of the Rhine. It was the systematic transformation of 371,000 enemy soldiers into advocates for democracy. It was proving through undeniable evidence that everything they'd fought for was built on lies, and everything they'd fought against was built on truth. The German prisoners who boarded trains in Mexia, Texas, in June 1943 as believers in the Third Reich departed American shores in 1946 as missionaries for democracy. Not because Americans had convinced them with arguments, but because reality had demolished their ideology through simple, overwhelming evidence. They had come to America expecting to find weakness. They found strength. They expected to find chaos. They found order. They expected to find poverty. They found abundance. They expected to find hatred. They found humanity. And in finding these things, they lost their faith in everything they'd been taught to believe. The trains that rolled through Texas in 1943 carried prisoners of war. The ships that departed American ports in 1946 carried agents of transformation. The difference between those two moments was the power of truth, witnessed firsthand, undeniable, transformative. In the end, America defeated Nazi Germany on the battlefield through superior resources, better logistics, and overwhelming industrial might. But America defeated Nazism itself in prison camps through something more powerful than any weapon. Through the simple, devastating power of letting enemies see the truth. The prisoners who saw too much saw everything. And what they saw changed them, changed Germany, and changed the world. Their story remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. Not through force, but through evidence. Not through propaganda, but through reality. Not through hatred, but through the overwhelming power of a free society showing enemies that there was a better way. The German prisoners came to America as believers in racial superiority, totalitarian control, and military conquest. They left as believers in democracy, freedom, and human dignity. That transformation, multiplied by 371,000, rebuilt Germany and reshaped Europe. And it all began with a train pulling into a small Texas town, carrying soldiers who were about to discover that everything they believed was wrong, and that the truth was better than any lie they'd been told.